죄송합니다. I'm going to speak in English because if I spoke in Korean, you'd all question my intellect. So thank you so very much. It's an honor to be here today and to share with you what I've learned about diversity and inclusion transformation in the 20 years that I've worked in this field. And you'll hear in my speech that there's a lot of themes that are very overlapping to the sessions you heard earlier today. So we live in an extraordinarily rich and amazing time of incredible interconnectedness and also interdependence. Technology-enabled globalization has introduced a level of human diversity never experienced before. And most impressively, we're now living at the dawn of the Asian century. If the 18th and 19th centuries were the British centuries, and the 20th was the US century, then surely the 21st will be the Asian century. As a person of Korean descent who grew up in a wonderful but also highly flawed and racist America, I was taught that I had to abandon all the things that made me most Korean in order to be successful. It was a continuous act of rebellion that I fought to retain my given name, Lee Bo-young. As a child, I could not have imagined a world where one day I'd see white and black American teens singing along in perfect Hangul to the K-pop artists like BTS and Blackpink, or to have a conversation with my Dutch and Brazilian colleagues about 힘센 여자 도봉수. But this is the global diversity that we live with today. And it's against this backdrop of diversity that we are also watching and participating in the rise of hyperpolarization across all spheres of our lives, political, economic, and most importantly, interpersonal. We're once again in an era of strong men, with leaders like Trump, Erdogan, Duterte, Modi, Putin, Maduro, and Johnson, riding waves of increasing nationalism and destabilizing rhetoric, often communicated to the world one tweet at a time. Cancel culture is rising online, and cyberbullying is driving our children to increasing rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide at ever younger ages. This polarization is alarming to say the very least, and creates both a real and existential threat to the very survival of our species. It makes it impossible to address some of the biggest crises of our time, including climate change and the renuclearization of the world. As goes society, so goes corporations, and our companies are no less immune to both the expansive diversity of the world and also the growing polarization within our workforces. If any of you wonder why diversity and inclusion has become such a thing in companies seemingly overnight, just look at the world we live in and it all starts to make sense. Companies now house the most globally diverse workforces that ever existed. Gender diversity, obviously, but also ethnic and cultural diversity, age diversity, sexual orientation, religion, disability, personality, and of course, mental health diversity. Furthermore, younger workers around the world want to work in organizations that are less hierarchical, less formal, and more equitable. And as workforces become more diverse, interpersonal clashes are becoming more pronounced, and charges of discrimination and harassment are up. In the US Equal Opportunity Employment Commission reports that over the past 15 years, rates of discrimination claims have actually increased by as much as 20%. Why is this? Well, one thing, simply, there's greater awareness about workplace discrimination and harassment. Social media platforms have made it easier for people to share stories about their experiences of discrimination. And as many of you may know, Uber's own journey to diversity and inclusion began with a very famous blog post written by a former female engineer. Second, large social movements like Me Too have empowered more workers to speak up. Me Too has taken a little bit longer to reach countries like Korea, but it's here now and it's not going away. If anything, it will become bigger. And as more companies continue to focus and commit themselves to diversity and inclusion, traditional media sources will continue to focus their coverage on the topic, and this then becomes a cycle. More organizational commitment, more coverage, more awareness, more commitment. And it's to the credit of corporate leaders Rather than shying away, ignoring, or actually increasing and inflaming some of this polarization, companies have started to signal that they really will respond in a much more constructive manner that runs oftentimes in opposition to the political leaders that we see in the world. When I was getting my MBA nearly 20 years ago, I was repeatedly taught that the leaders of a company had one singular fiduciary responsibility, and that was to increase shareholder value. And the unspoken rule, of course, was that we were going to increase shareholder value by any means necessary. Anyone who wanted to work and succeed in a large company had to fall in line and adapt and mold themselves to the prevailing majority culture and the behaviors of the predominant culture. The message in business school to someone like myself, a female who would eventually become a mother, a racial and ethnic minority, an immigrant with a funny name, a person with a learning disability, an introvert, and someone who cared deeply about social responsibility, was that either I would have to change myself to fit in, or I would have to accept the fact that I would never succeed or advance in my career. It was this messaging that led me ultimately to a career in diversity and inclusion at a time when companies, no one really cared about the topic. So what a delight it was for me when recently a consortium of over 180 US corporate CEOs, including Jeff Bezos, and led by Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, said that corporations now have a responsibility beyond their shareholders, that corporations must act as forces for social good, and they have an ethical responsibility to ensure social stability through the provision of fair wages, protection of the environment, and support for local communities. Where our political leaders seem to be failing us, corporations are now stepping up to fill that ethical void. In fact, the polarization corporations, in the face of polarization, corporations are committing to diversity and inclusion, equity, and becoming forces of social good. It's within this global landscape that corporations around the world, including those here in Korea, are now starting to ask the question, what do we do? What do we really fundamentally do to start increasing diversity in our workplaces and building cultural inclusion? And to begin answering that question, particularly here in Korea, we have to first examine the journey that Korea has been on since 1960s, but not through the typical economic or technological lens, but through the lens of social diversity transformation. Everyone knows about Korea's amazing broadband speeds and access. They know about the hard-fought journey up the manufacturing value chain. Once Korea was the sneaker manufacturing capital of the world, and now it's one of the largest producers of LED screens and semiconductors. And these are amazing stories, but we also have to look at Korea through a social transformation lens. And to give you a little context, and some of you may already know this information, let's look at a few of the data points. In 1960, the population in Korea was 25 million. Its GDP per capita was only $79 US. The life expectancy, 52.4. Post-secondary education access, only 1% to 2% of the population had access. The population over the age of 65 was 2.9%. The birth rate was 6.16. And the ethnic mix was, of course, nearly 100% Korean. And where are we today? The population has now doubled, more than doubled. The GDP has been on an amazing journey to approximately 33,000 US. And for context, China is at 8,800. The UK is at 39,000, and the US is at 59,000. The life expectancy is now 82 years. The post-secondary education access is at about 70%. Over 14% of the population is over the age of 65, which is actually one of the highest percentages. The birth rate is now 0.98, which is the lowest in the world. Japan has the second lowest birth rate of 1.44, which is nearly 50% higher than here in Korea. And about 4% of the population is foreign-born, which is about 2 million people. The largest population is that of ethnic Chinese, followed by Vietnamese, US, Thai, Filipino, Uzbek, Japanese, Indonesian, Cambodian, Mongolian, and Tibetan. And for contrast, Canada, which has the highest rate of foreign-born residents, has a population of 20.9% born outside of Canada. 1 in 5 Canadians are not born in Canada. And in the US, that number is about 13.7%, which I am a part of. This is an amazing, stunning journey, which all Koreans should be proud of. The majority of you sitting here today lived through this transformation and organically experienced it, so it feels comfortable to you, and it feels normal. But let me tell you what it felt like for someone who left. I'm going to share a personal story with you because the work of D&I is essentially personal. So my family immigrated from Korea in 1978, and I was just 2.5 years old. My family was more fortunate than most when we left. My father was one of the few people who had a university degree. He graduated from one of the Sky universities, and he was a director in a pharmaceutical company. My mother had a certificate in accounting, and she worked as a bookkeeper before she had children. We were upper middle class, and I remember we lived in a great big greenhouse behind a big wall in the heart of Seoul. I was the third daughter born to my parents. When I asked my parents why we left Korea, they explained that there was no guarantee of this economic transformation that was about to take place here. And though life was comfortable for us, my father claims that he looked at his family and realized that he was the father of 3 young girls. And he could not guarantee that we girls would be able to achieve our own goals in life within the rigid gender roles and embedded sexism of Korea at that time. He wanted his daughters to be educated and to achieve whatever goals and dreams we aspired to, unencumbered by other people's expectations. And this is a pretty progressive view for most Korean men, even today, and let alone for a man born in 1943 in what is now part of North Korea. So when given the opportunity, my parents immigrated. And this meant we went from living in a big house to living in a 1-bedroom apartment with what would eventually be 7 family members. It meant my father went from working in a pharmaceutical company to working in a fish factory and ultimately running a small shoe store. My family faced racism and discrimination, poverty, and my parents had to learn to navigate a country and a language and a culture that was unfamiliar to them, and often at times had to rely on their children to help translate basic forms and documents. But their sacrifice obviously paid off. I'm obviously here, a senior executive at a tech company, and I'm also married, and somehow I've been able to create an amazing life with 2 young children, the ages of 8 and 2. My family was not one to visit Korea very often, so my knowledge of Korea was entirely defined by the pictures and stories that were told to me by my parents and my grandmother. And because my parents never visited or returned to Korea, the imprint of Korea that was shaped in my mind was that of 1978. I returned to Korea for the very first time in 2003. A consortium of chaebols as well as the government ran a recruiting program where they wanted to recruit foreign-raised and educated but ethnically Korean high-potential young people to return to Korea and work and live here. It was, in a way, a diversity recruiting program. I was an MBA student at the time, and I'm not really sure how they identified me, but I was invited. And we were a group of about 30 Koreans from around the world. I had met German Koreans, Russian Koreans, Canadians, Chinese, Australian, British, and even Brazilian Koreans. And here's a fun little fact. Even though we were all ethnically Korean, we all agreed that we each looked like the country we were raised in. So the German Korean looked German, the American Koreans looked American, the Russian Koreans looked Russian. And ultimately, we concluded it was simply because we used our faces differently, we smiled differently, we spoke differently, and we moved our bodies differently. Our cultures define a large part of our identities. So for 1 week, this odd, diverse group of ethnic Koreans shared a mix of cultural and corporate experiences. And this experience was really eye-opening for all of us, but for me, who hadn't been back since 1978, I was completely blown away by how different and foreign Korea felt to me. Of course, the broadband speeds were outstanding, the buildings were beautiful and modern. And I was actually amazed at how much English was being incorporated into Korean. It took me way longer than I care to admit to figure out what the word 파이팅 meant. Everything was different from what I thought I knew about Korea, even down to the food. Everything came with a lot of cheese on top. I wasn't sure about that. But there was one thing that really didn't change. Because this trip was essentially a corporate recruiting visit, nearly every day we had a chance to visit and tour several large corporations. We met dozens of senior leaders, and we got to see innovation projects and got to ask them questions about their strategies going forward. I should stop here now and mention that of the 30 people invited, approximately 40% of us were women. And during the course of the entire week, the only women we saw in the companies were either receptionists, assistants, or the women who came in and took our coffee and tea orders. We spoke with no female team leaders and no executives. It was something that all of us women were aware of, and we discussed it amongst ourselves. On the very last day of the program, the program hosted a panel discussion with four or five senior leaders, and we were able to ask them any questions that we wanted. And when it became my chance to ask a question, I tend to be a little outspoken and direct. And so I asked the question, this entire week, we haven't seen or spoken to a single female team leader or executive. It's something all of us women noticed. If the point of the program was to get us excited about a career here in Korea, what kind of career opportunities would I really have as a woman? And can anyone guess what the response was? Yeah, so this was the verbatim response, as I recall it. Oh, don't worry. Everyone will know that you're not really Korean, and they'll actually treat you as a foreigner, so they won't treat you like the other Korean women. You'll get a lot of opportunities. Right, I know. And some of you are pretty shocked about this response, but some of you are like, I could imagine someone saying that even today. And think about this. First and foremost, I don't think a single woman who went on that program came back to Korea to work here, but I do know that at least 3 men did return, and at least 1 man is still here, has settled in Korea, and now has a family and works permanently. So I want you to think about the implications of that response for a moment. First, the leader all but admitted that in Korea, women have very limited career opportunities. And secondly, he all but admitted that women in companies are treated differently from the men, and they're probably treated poorly. And thirdly, he felt that this was normal, and he was actually proud of his response. Now, this was 2003, and I would hope that things have gotten a little bit better here in Korea, but a few key statistics indicate that progress may not have happened as much as we hope. First, let's go back and look at that birth rate of 0.98. No one knows for sure why Koreans are no longer getting married or having children, but a very strong hypothesis is simply that with the level of workplace discrimination that mothers face, they simply choose to not have children and run that risk of discrimination. The excuse that young Koreans are merely selfish and don't want children rings extremely hollow, untrue, and frankly very defensive. In fact, amongst developed economies with the highest rates of gender equality, you also find some of the highest rates of birth in the developing world. In one study from the University of Stockholm, researchers found that there existed a positive correlation between the length of time a father takes parental leave and the occurrence of a second birth of a child, with the peak impact of male parental leave and second birth occurrence being when fathers took between 30 and 60 days after the birth of their child. In another study, researchers actually found that fathers who take more parental leave are more likely to be more equitable in the distribution of domestic and childcare responsibilities in the home for the long term. Simply, when men bond with their children early in their lives, they're more likely to want to maintain that bond and engage more fully in the child's life. This then enables women to focus on their careers and also consider the possibility of having more children without risk of impact to their careers. This is one reason why Uber and other progressive companies have made gender equality in parental leave a core part of our inclusion policy. At Uber, we offer 18 weeks of fully paid parental leave to all full-time employees, regardless of gender. This includes becoming parents through birth, surrogacy, adoption, foster, and all the other ways people become a family. The more men experience the same treatment as women, the more barriers are removed for women in the workplace. Any inclusion policy that only focuses on women will be meaningless if they don't address deep-rooted traditional sexist gender norms both at home and in the workplace. In order to include and advance women and anyone really truly, you don't have to change the women. The women are already smart, they're hardworking, they're ambitious, and they want to achieve to their highest ability. You have to change the men, and that includes all of you. You all must change. Korea also has the dubious honor of simultaneously having one of the highest rates of access to post-secondary education for women across all OECD nations, but also the lowest rate of female workforce participation for those with university degrees. Just over 50% of Korean women between the ages of 24 and 55 participate in the workplace, and this is one of the lowest rates. Women now also make up the majority of all university entrants in Korea, with 7% more women enter university than men, even when you account for military service. And if Korea is like any other developed country, I'm sure that Korean women also make up the majority of the highest scoring students on all tests of achievement and proficiency. And according to the World Economic Forum, Korea ranks 115 out of 145 countries in gender equality. That means that countries like Malawi, the Maldives, and Sierra Leone actually have better gender equality than Korea. And Korea is immediately followed by Guinea, Ethiopia, and Benin. What happens to an economy when you educate and empower women and then tell them that they have very limited career opportunities? What does a nation lose in innovation and economic competitiveness when companies are allowed to discriminate and defy laws that are meant to promote equality and fair treatment in the workplace? And there's quite a bit of research out there about the relationship between diversity and inclusion and innovation, and I'll just share one of them. According to a recent research study by Boston Consulting Group that examined 1,700 companies in 8 countries, when a company had above average total diversity, measured by 6 dimensions of diversity: migration, industry, career path, gender, education, and age. Those companies with the highest levels of diversity were both 19% points higher in innovation revenue and 9 percentage points higher in EBIT margins on average. In total, the presence of diversity and inclusion factors was worth up to 12.9 percentage points of innovation revenue. If you have a diverse workplace, you increase innovation and you increase profitability. What if the simple act of creating, what if the simple act of removing barriers to the participation of diverse people in the labor market and also creating a workplace that makes people feel psychologically safe led to upwards of 10% more revenue and growth? What logical person or company would deny such near guaranteed growth? The answer is nobody. But here's the problem. Humans are not always logical. We are fundamentally emotional, and we often select our own comfort, even if that comfort means poor performance and outcome. In my near 20 years of working in diversity and inclusion, I've learned one very fundamental and clear lesson. The work and practices that lead to D&I transformation are really easy. And you heard me right, they're really easy. The biggest challenge to creating diverse and inclusive workplaces is not because the solutions don't exist. They're all there. It's because people and companies lack the will and the courage to change. And we all like to fundamentally believe that we're good people. And because we're good, we can't be sexist or racist or homophobic. And we can't believe that people with disabilities are just somehow broken. It's hard for humans to believe that we are and admit that we are biased, that we are sexist, and some part of our brain believes that women should just stay at home, and if we do work outside of the home, that we're fundamentally bad mothers. That we are racist, and that we believe that people with darker skin are just somehow inferior. That we are homophobic and believe that people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender are just somehow strange and abnormal. That we are ableist, and we believe that people with disabilities should just be hidden away from society. And that we are ageist, and we believe that old people are somehow inherently better and smarter than all of us. We cannot treat people with dignity when we don't see them fully worthy of that dignity. So I've shared a really difficult message today, but I do want to let you know that change is possible. Since 2017, Uber has dedicated itself to becoming the most diverse and inclusive company in the world, so we can reflect the diversity and inclusion of our customers and partners. And you can see here, since 2017, we've had near 5% growth in the overall representation of our women in the workforce. We're now 40% women globally, and in some of our regions, we're actually at 50%. We have also achieved promotion parity last year, and we've been able to maintain that parity for 3 cycles of promotion. Change is absolutely possible. The greatest privilege of my life is that I was raised by feminist parents, and especially a father who simply could not bear the thought of his daughters not being allowed to achieve to their highest ability. I was raised in a country that, though deeply, deeply flawed, and at times very racist, showed me role models of what I could become if I worked hard, and taught me that being big and loud and opinionated were good things, that I should fight hierarchy, and that I should grab my seat at the table. And as a woman, a wife, a mother, an immigrant from a racial minority background, as someone who grew up incredibly poor with both physical and learning disabilities, I know that the life I created for myself in the US would not have been possible if my family had stayed in Korea. That either my daughters would not exist or that I would not have my career. And this makes me deeply sad. Korea has fought too hard to survive and preserve its language, its culture, and its identity, to slowly eat itself from the inside because of sexism or racism or classism or ableism. Change is possible, and I hope that someday, 20 years from now, I once again come back to Korea and I simply don't recognize it like the last time I came. But not because of the shiny buildings or the amazing technology, but because of the amazing diversity of its people, the innovation of its companies, the growth of the population, and the equality and inclusion of its society. Thank you so much for your time.